Thanks for coming along tonight, where Paul Kelly makes a welcome return to the Sydney Institute. He was last here when he spoke about Morrison's mission, which was the foreign policy of the previous coalition government, which holds up well today because of the developments that took place then. But tonight the discussion is on the Albanese government, early signals and coming challenges, and of course Paul Kelly is editor-at-large at The Australian and the author of numerous books. But tonight, the Albanese government, early signals and coming challenges. Paul, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gerard. Ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be back talking at the Sydney Institute again. I want to begin by acknowledging Anne and Gerard Henderson and their very long innings running in the Sydney Institute, and their support for this forum and the diversity of the speakers that they have at this forum. My subject tonight is the Albanese government, early signs and coming challenges. It's a speculative subject. There are many early signs on display this week, the opening week of the Parliament. Let's look at a few of them. Witness the introduction of the climate change bill that legislates the government's 43% emissions reduction target for 2030, the introduction of a bill to address the crisis in aged care, a bill to set up the Jobs and Skills Australia agenda, and a bill to remove fringe benefits tax to make electric cars cheaper, so that, in the words of the Minister, more families who want them can afford them. This is the opening week of the new Parliament, but the Albanese government has been in office for 2 months. Its character is not yet formed. Now that's a critical point. It's why the first section of this address is called Early Signs. And as I talk about the early signs, I'll also talk about the longer run challenges. Early signs can often be prescient about a government's true character, and sometimes the early signs can be misleading. Witness that Bob Hawke, in the early days of the Hawke government, wanted to get rid of Paul Keating as Treasurer because he felt Keating wasn't up to the job. I would make a number of overarching points about the early signs. First, the Albanese government's position is stronger than its 77 seats and narrow majority suggests. That's because the coalition opposition is so weakened, reduced to 58 seats. The coalition lost seats to Labor, the Teals and the Greens. And it's the coalition's structural weakness in the Parliament and in the country that helps to empower Anthony Albanese as Prime Minister. And there is this sense of empowerment being radiated by the Prime Minister and by his senior ministers. There's no question about that. Second, there's a new diversity in the Parliament and I believe in the country. The crossbench in the House of Representatives is 16 MPs. This is unprecedented, and they are overwhelmingly of the centre-left. This election saw a significant shift to the left in Australian politics. While Labor's primary vote is historically low for a government, it benefits from the election of more centre-left MPs sitting on the crossbench. Albanese is a very experienced parliamentarian. He always has been. His role during the Gerard minority government as leader of the House was fundamental in helping that parliament work, in helping Julia Gillard maintain her position as Deputy Prime Minister, and his skills then in working with that crossbench were quite conspicuous. Third, Labor believes the election demonstrated a new mood in the country, and it seeks to mobilise and represent that mood. So what is the mood? Well, from the Prime Minister's remarks over a period of time, I think you can interpret what he thinks is the mood. And from what Albanese says, it's characterised by support for diversity, inclusion, compassion, fairness, more emphasis on integrity in government, greater obligation to act on climate change, and a community willingness to see people working together. Hence the September Jobs and Skills Summit. By representing these values and moving, I believe, to define himself by these values, in a way Scott Morrison didn't define himself as Prime Minister by values, Albanese hopes to lift Labor's standing and lift its primary vote over the course of the next 12 months compared with the primary vote it got at the election. I know there's been a lot of talk about changing the way Parliament operates and new standards in politics. I'm far more sceptical about that. But I have identified a series of characteristics that I think Albanese believes are represented by the election, and he is going to try and mobilise and marshal those characteristics for the government. Point 4. Albanese is fixated on his mandate. He's fixated on implementing the mandate. Witness their announcement about the abolition of the Australian Building and Construction Commission, their action on aged care, their action on electric vehicles and various other policies. However, it's equally important to note that the messages are that they won't go outside their mandate. In that sense, I think Albanese has learnt from Tony Abbott's mistakes. There's a trap though. And the trap is that the world changed before the campaign and during the campaign, which meant much of the agenda, much of the mandate on which Albanese got elected as Prime Minister doesn't really fit the circumstances anymore, notably the world of higher inflation and lower growth. So this will constitute a serious challenge for the Prime Minister down the track. The fifth point I want to make relates to climate action. The government feels politically empowered on climate change. It's running on climate change in an aggressive fashion, in a way it hasn't run for a few years on this issue. It believes that it has the real political ascendancy on this issue over the coalition. And the really interesting thing is this is despite the global energy crisis and despite the domestic supply drama in relation to energy policy in recent weeks. Climate Minister Chris Bowen is running an aggressive agenda around climate. He says the last election was a climate change election. The government's climate bill, which was introduced today, is, I think, a critically important bill, despite the government saying it's not essential. And that's true, it's not essential. The coalition is not going to support this bill, and that's no surprise. Peter Dutton, as Liberal leader, has got to honour his own supporters, and most of his supporters, of course, those people who voted for the coalition at the election, as distinct from voting for the Teals, clearly would not support Labor's climate policy or the 43% emissions reduction target. So the reality is there will be an ongoing significant difference on climate change policy between the Albanese government and the Dutton opposition. But what is really interesting here, I think, is that a lot of this debate is about the politics of the left. Now, we've seen the Greens perform very strongly at the election, and of course so did the Teals. And to a certain extent, when it comes to climate change, the Greens and the Teals are competing for the same votes. The Greens leader, Adam Bandt, has attacked the 43% target as being grossly inadequate and has demanded from the government that it cease new ventures in relation to fossil fuels, and the government has made it clear that it won't do that. So the point to make here, as far as Albanese and Bowen are concerned, is they're not going to make any significant concession to the Greens at all on this bill. They've changed a couple of things here and there which aren't significant in terms of their overall commitment. So essentially, they're playing hardball with the Greens. They're putting the Greens under pressure. And essentially, Labor's saying to the Greens, well, it's up to you guys. Do you have the pragmatism and sense to vote for our bill and break away from what you did in 2009 and 2010 when you sabotaged Kevin Rudd's emissions reduction policy, or not? And we'll have to see the way the Greens play it. But the signals at this stage, and they may change because the vote is some way off yet, the signals at this stage suggest that at the end of the day the Greens might vote for the bill. If that happens, that is significant. That is a significant movement from the Greens. It's a significant reappraisal from the Greens, and I think it does also partly reflect the competition between the Greens and the Teals on the left. However, if this bill is passed, I think this will be an empowering event for the Albanese government. It will demonstrate that they've succeeded where previous Labor governments did not succeed. I think one of the interesting features of the whole debate is the forcefulness of Chris Bowen as Climate Minister. And given the international situation and the fact that we've seen a number of countries off the back of the war in the Ukraine going back to fossil fuels, Bowen's message is we double down on renewables. We don't accept the validity of these arguments that other countries are adopting who are vulnerable to Russian pressure. That is that there needs to be a revival of fossil fuels to a certain extent. That's not the message from the International Energy Agency, and it's certainly not the message coming from the Albanese government. Now, that is important. And so one of the questions here is, how will the policy and politics of climate change evolve over the course of the next 3 years, given this really firm position that the government's taken at this stage? Point number 6. The government so far is operating, I think, with a lot of impressive confidence. It knows where it wants to move, so it's moving on climate change, but it knows where it wants to be cautious, and it's particularly cautious on economic policy. It's not rushing into any new economic policy announcements at all. So it's sending, I think, quite a lot of mixed messages. And I think a lot of this is quite astute. Look at the situation with foreign policy. The government has changed the tone and, to a certain extent, policy in some areas in relation to France, in relation to the Pacific. They've changed the tone in relation to China. We've seen some early engagement with China. However, I would argue that the new government has accepted almost completely Scott Morrison's strategic agenda in terms of national security and foreign policy in relation to China, the United States alliance, the Quad, the AUKUS agreement with the UK and the US, and relations with Japan and India. So I think at this stage the main story is a change of tone, a greater emphasis on diplomacy, but I don't think there's any fundamental reset in strategic terms. Now, the government is being congratulated by much of the media for what the media says is a reset, but I don't think it's a reset at all. There's a lot more energy from Penny Wong, and I think her diplomacy in the Pacific has been very impressive and is something to be welcomed. And of course, one of the interesting features is the way the government has injected climate change as a foreign policy principle. It's using this everywhere, with the Americans, with the Pacific, and with Europe. Although I think Richard Marles did overreach the other day in the United States when he then declared that climate change had become fundamental to the alliance with the United States. I think he should have probably looked at the policy of the Republicans on climate change before he made that particular announcement. However, there is a subtlety about the new government and a sense, frankly, that they're still making up their mind about what sort of government they are. In the Australian today, talking about them, I said at this stage the Albanese government was a mixed tapestry, bold in aspiration, cautious in content, incremental in policy, strong on climate change, anxious to prove its economic responsibility, faithful to the unions, keen to work with business, searching for common ground, skillful at discrediting the Morrison legacy, pragmatic in method, and keen to display its progressive credentials. My seventh point is, as usual with the new government, everything depends upon the mettle of the Prime Minister. What sort of Prime Minister will Anthony Albanese make? Well, it's early days, but looking at Australian political history over a long period of time, you've got to be very careful about early judgments of Prime Ministers. Remember that Tony Abbott and Kevin Rudd were both elected with a much more substantial majority as first-term Prime Ministers than what Anthony Albanese has got, and neither Abbott nor Rudd saw out the first term as Prime Minister. And I also pointed out in the Australian this morning, and a lot of people have forgotten this, that there were very profound uncertainties about John Howard's first term as Prime Minister when he felt obliged to go back, take the proposal for the GST out of the top drawer and run on it because he was concerned about decline through stagnation in his first term as Prime Minister. I think Albanese's success as a politician has been his ability to grow. Nobody remotely picked Anthony Albanese on his arrival as a future Prime Minister. He's self-made, in Parliament for 26 years, and having been through 10 election campaigns. His strengths are parliamentary skills, respect for colleagues, and affinity with ordinary people, and political common sense. But there's one certainty for Albanese. His first term will be laden with dangers that cannot be foreseen. If I was to speculate, I'd say that he will be a Prime Minister very different to Kevin Rudd. He will not be fixated on operating as an intervening centralist, overriding his ministers, going into all sorts of details here and there into various portfolios. I think Albanese will be more of a delegator, using the cabinet to take broad decisions and then expecting his senior ministers to implement those decisions. That means an approach as Prime Minister with his cabinet and with his colleagues more akin to that of Bob Hawke. If in fact Albanese does adopt that approach, I think that will be the right way to go. I think when you look at the cabinet, there a lot of potential in this cabinet, and I think one of the features of these ministers at the moment is they are focused on learning their briefs, finding out about the secret aspects of dysfunction in their portfolio, talking to their stakeholders, and essentially working out exactly how they intend to operate. One of the underreported features, I think, of the Cabinet is many of these ministers lived through the Rudd-Gillard period. And having lived through the Rudd-Gillard period, they've all drawn lessons from that. They don't want a repeat of those years at all. I think that they're strong when it comes to foreign policy and security. The Deputy Prime Minister is the Defence Minister, and the Senate Leader, Penny Wong, is the Foreign Minister. That is, the Deputy Prime Minister, Richard Marles, is the Defence Minister, and Penny Wong, the Senate Leader, is the Foreign Minister. The Minister in the hot seat is Jim Chalmers. There's no question about that. I think so far he's performed very well as a communicator, talking about the economic problems, but of course, at the moment, to this stage, he is untested. There is a lot of talent in this front bench. Chris Bowen, Tanya Plibersek, Mark Butler, Jason Clare, Madeleine King, Ed Husick, Claire O'Neill, Michelle Rowland, just to mention some of them. Okay, let's go to the big issue. And the big issue is the economic challenge. And essentially, there are two economic challenges. There's the first challenge, which is the global and domestic inflation threat. And this is an extremely dangerous challenge, which could do a lot of political harm to the Albanese government. And the second economic challenge is the longer term challenge that we've been aware of for some time, and that is Australia's poor productivity, our sub-performance when it comes to economic growth over a period of years. That is a longer term challenge. So we've seen in the last 24 hours the warning from the International Monetary Fund about the extent of the global downturn. We know that central banks around the world, having misjudged the inflation breakout, are now increasing interest rates, desperate to try and curb inflation and trying to prevent stagflation in a number of developed economies. Inflation in Australia today is 6.1%, given the figures that were just released in the 12 months to the June quarter, and that was 1.8% in the most recent quarter, and we know it will continue to go up. The current cash rate from the Reserve Bank is 1.35%, and we can expect that at the next Reserve Bank meeting, the bank will continue to increase interest rates on this established strategy, probably by another 50 basis points. Bank Governor Philip Lowe, in his speech last week, wants the world to know the magnitude of the challenge Australia faces. The bank's goal is to return inflation in Australia to the 2 to 3% target while keeping the economy on an even keel. How hard is this? Lowe said, and I quote, "The path ahead is a narrow one, and it is clouded in uncertainty," unquote. That's from the man whose job it is to curb inflation and try and ensure the Australian economy doesn't go into recession. So, recession is a risk in Anthony Albanese's first term. I think that we won't go into recession. I think that Australia is in a much better position than a number of other developed economies, and I think we are more likely to avert recession than the United States, but there's no doubt that the recession risk is there, and the risk intensifies the higher inflation goes up. So the higher inflation, the higher the probability that there will be a hard landing. So you get the picture, risks abound. Governor Lowe says that Australia must halt inflation expectations, and that means ensuring inflation expectations don't get embedded in the psychology. Once that happens, firms jack up prices and they meet the latest wage demands, generating a self-reinforcing cycle. So, it's important that companies are sensible and balanced in meeting wage demands. And in this sense, of course, the big responsibility will be on Lowe and the Reserve Bank. And the Governor made it clear last week that he expects the cash rate will increase to 2.5% and probably more, with a number of market economists expecting that the cash rate will go up to 3%. The problem for the Prime Minister is that the single most important issue at the election was cost of living. Anthony Albanese, during the election campaign, spoke more about cost of living than any other single issue. So, the question is, how tolerant will the electorate be in terms of the ongoing inflation problem and cost of living problem? In terms of how long the problem will exist, well, I think we're looking into 2023 next year. It's going to take us till 2023 till we see real movement in terms of inflation coming down, and of course that relates to wages. This high inflation means, of course, that real wages are negative, and real wages will continue to be negative until at some point next year. So again, having negative real wages is a direct repudiation of the commitment that Anthony Albanese made at the election, when again he promised to deliver increased wages. So this joint problem of cost of living and wages is going to plague this government for the rest of the year, and it will be interesting to watch Albanese's political skill in attempting to manage that. The government, in policy terms, is totally hostage to the Reserve Bank. And the question is whether the Reserve Bank, having miscalculated during the pandemic, will be able to get the settings right now when it comes to managing inflation. So this will be a difficult project in political attrition for the Prime Minister. One of the questions is how much damage will be done to the government during this period. The second challenge that I've talked about is the longer run economic challenge, and this is not a survivability issue at the moment, but there are a number of points to make about the longer run economic challenge. The first is the really modest economic agenda on which the government was elected. So they ran on the commitment to renewables, generating greater economic momentum and greater economic growth, childcare leading to greater female participation in the workforce, support for manufacturing industry, a greater emphasis on skills, no fundamental taxation reform. There's a modest taxation change in relation to taxation of multinationals, but off the back of the Bill Shorten experiment of the 2019 election, when Labor ran on very significant taxation changes, the really conspicuous feature of Anthony Albanese's agenda at the last election was no really significant taxation reform, and I think we can assume, given Albanese's fixation about the mandate, that we are not going to see significant taxation reform this term. So, this raises the question then about the coming budget. What sort of budget are we likely to see? Well, this is a conundrum at the moment. We really don't know. I'd make the following points. The opening budget for a new government must be an ambitious budget. And so the question to look for is, where will the ambition be? Certainly, I think the budget will implement the election agenda. So we'll see commitments in terms of childcare, we'll see commitments in terms of aged care. There's no doubt at all about that. But given the inflation challenge, the question is to what extent the budget will contain spending cuts. The new Treasurer has been really cautious about this. What he says all the time is that the incoming government will eliminate will eliminate coalition rorts. Now, clearly there'll have to be some spending cuts, but I think the new government will be pretty modest and careful in terms of spending cuts. And so I therefore conclude that the budget will be a budget based on policy incrementalism. There'll be a lot of talk, they'll dress it up, it'll be their first budget, they'll talk of it in terms of being a major reform budget, but I'm inclined to think that when you look through the rhetoric, there will be important measures, but my judgment at this stage will be that it will be a budget based on incrementalism. And that raises the question, where will the productivity gains come from? I can't see them coming from industrial relations changes. We'll have to see what comes from the summit. We'll have to see whether we see changes to the enterprise bargaining system. But I don't think we're going to see significant productivity changes. So I'd finish up by making 3 points at the end. One thing to watch for, I think, is Labor's fidelity to the unions and to the super funds. Now, we did see some announcements about superannuation policy. There's been very little reporting about this, but in the Financial Review, Chanticleer a little while ago did make a few comments about this, saying proposed amendments to the superannuation industry will wind back the shift to higher transparency under former Assistant Treasurer Jane Hume. Hume's laws, which were passed late last year, and Josh Frydenberg had a lot to say about this at the time, were designed to force superannuation funds to provide members with meaningful information before annual meetings. The reform, which was pushed through despite ferocious lobbying, was welcome because it put the spotlight on costs that have nothing to do with boosting member returns. Now the superannuation industry, which includes industry funds and retail funds, have succeeded in moving against measures that promote greater transparency. I think it's worthwhile looking very carefully at what this government does in terms of superannuation and the extent to which they change some of the superannuation reforms of the previous government. And clearly, the fact that the government was prepared to get on the front foot so aggressively in terms of the changes to the Australian Building and Construction Commission, again is a very, very powerful signal of fidelity to the union movement. The other point I wanted to raise, the other question I wanted to raise related to progressivism. How progressive will this government be? I think it's an important question. What we've seen in recent days is that they are moving against the cashless debit card, which was a rather agonised initiative of the former government. And the fact that they've been keen to do this early on is quite important. Another related issue is what they will do about more grog in the Northern Territory going into these Aboriginal communities with the phasing out of the Howard government legislation. Will the Albanese government express criticism about this or seek to influence the Northern Territory government, seeing the effect of this policy will be guaranteed to increase violence against Aboriginal women and to clearly increase violence in some of these Aboriginal communities. So how will the Albanese government handle these sorts of issues? And this raises broader questions about progressivism. So how will the Albanese government respond to the campaign by local government councils, for example, to change the day of Australia Day when this comes up next year? How will the Albanese government respond to a range of issues about identity politics? And the final point I'll make, and I'll close off my remarks here, concerns the voice to Parliament. Anthony Albanese has a deeply committed and deeply sincere view about the voice to Parliament, and he's made it clear that a referendum will be put in the first term. When I interviewed the Minister, Linda Burney, after the election, she said to me that she was relaxed about a timetable. She was not committed to putting a referendum this term, but the Prime Minister's made it clear the referendum will be this term. There are many, many issues here, and the fundamental one, of course, is the extent to which the government feels obliged to spell out what sort of voice to Parliament it's looking at. Will this be a voice to the government as well as to the Parliament? What will be the ambit of the voice? Will it just cover issues that are overwhelmingly concerned with Indigenous affairs and Indigenous peoples, or will it deal with issues that any Indigenous person is involved in, which relate to tax policy, welfare, foreign policy and so on? Will it be an elected body? How will that play out in terms of the Australian Electoral Commission electoral rolls? How will the voice interact with the Indigenous members of Parliament, given the very significant increase in the Indigenous members of Parliament? And what will be the justification the government offers for putting a racially based advisory body into the Australian Constitution, standing next to the House of Representatives and the Senate? And so the big bottom line here is the extent to which Anthony Albanese, given his commitment to the voice, can turn this into an issue which unites the country rather than divides the country. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Paul, so many thanks to Paul Kelly for a very comprehensive analysis. So come to questions and discussion. I'll operate this part of the room there, and we'll operate the rest, and then people on the Zoom can call in as you wish. So there are a lot of people on this tonight, so either here or on the call, so keep your comments or questions brief, like this one. Paul, if you come back here, talk to the back of the room. Now, you mentioned the essential problems facing the government is inflation and productivity, and of course energy prices is part of inflation, but as you will recall, on the night before the election, the Prime Minister went on 7:30 with Lee Sale, said that under Albanese government, childcare costs would be reduced and energy prices. There is also that other promise of $275. Now, in this kind of context, over 3 years, is that kind of promise something that might cause problems if the move to renewables continues and there's less incentive for anyone to keep power stations going?
I think this will be an important issue. Anthony Albanese was absolutely specific during the election campaign. Labor's policy when it comes to energy prices was the reduction of $275 with cheaper childcare as well. Well, I think there's no sign as one looks into the future that energy prices will be coming down anytime soon, and clearly energy prices in this country are going to very significantly increase over the next few months, and the operators have made this very, very clear. So I think this will be an ongoing issue for the government. I think it's interesting to see that the Coalition has identified this already. When the Coalition talks about energy, essentially it just focuses on this commitment, the $275 commitment, and we'll hear plenty more about this. The government, of course, never mentions this commitment anymore, and that's perfectly understandable.
There's a question here, and I've got one on the Zoom here.
Hi, Paul. Two-pronged question. Do you agree that Albanese has a glass jaw on economics? And will the opposition be able to get at it, particularly in Parliament, getting past Chalmers?
A number of people, a lot of them from the coalition, and some journalists talk about Anthony Albanese having a glass jaw, and we'll have to wait and see. One of the qualities a Prime Minister has got to have is the capacity to absorb punishment. And that's pretty easy at the start, and it gets more difficult as you go on, and your ratings decline and the attacks get more difficult. So I wouldn't make a particular judgment about Anthony Albanese having a glass jaw, but I would say something about his comments on the economy. I think he is inexperienced in terms of being a Prime Minister making pronouncements on the economy. And you've got to be really precise about this. He made a mistake last week when he was talking about the Reserve Bank. And he said, talking about inflation, words to the effect that it was very important that the Reserve Bank didn't go too far on the inflation front. In other words, exposing his secret fears as Prime Minister. Bad mistake. It was only one line. It's only one line, but it was a straw in the wind. What he should be doing as Prime Minister is supporting the Reserve Bank in its efforts to combat inflation, keeping the economy on an even keel. So one of the things that I think we'll be studying about the Prime Minister is the way he talks about the economy. And this raises another question. Will he be an economic policy interventionist Prime Minister, or will he leave, by and large, economic policy to the Treasurer? That's going to be a really important issue to assess and watch.
Got a question here from Justin Levito. Do you think the electorate will stay the course if the going gets tough during the transition to a renewable energy economy?
When it comes to the electorate's attitude on renewables and climate change, I think there's no doubt at all that there are sections of the electorate which are now much more committed to renewables and much more committed to climate change action. That's one of the lessons of the election. The country is divided on this. A lot of the traditional coalition constituencies are suspicious and concerned about this. So we'll have to see the way this issue plays out. And that's going to be a difficult assessment to make. But as I said, I think one of the really interesting features at the start of this government is their confidence on climate change. They are running on this. And clearly there's going to be an ongoing, very significant difference between the Coalition and Labor on this issue.
Okay, it's a question here.
What does the zigzag on pandemic leave tell us about the government's ability to make hard decisions in light of the inflation problems and also the debt situation?
Yeah, it's a good question. But all I'd say is that I think there was a certain logic to that reversal, given the attitude of the premiers, the attitude of the health authorities, the attitude of the media, the situation with the pandemic. So I understand the Prime Minister changing position on the issue. So I think there was a logic to that, and I think that decision is defendable. But there's no doubt it does then raise the question about what the mettle of this government is. Because if we're talking about the budget, if we're talking about government spending, okay, I can understand that naturally Labor will attack what it designates as Morrison government rorts, and that's what it should do. That's what it should do. That's what former Liberal treasurers in private say it should do. All that's fine. But the question is, if we're going to make significant inroads in terms of government spending, so that fiscal policy supports monetary policy, that's going to require really hard decisions. And so I think there's a very major question mark about the extent to which this government will be prepared to court any political backlash from taking those sorts of decisions. Again, Anthony Albanese watched the first Abbott budget. When Albanese's he's seen a lot of politics. He's absorbed a lot of messages. And he's incorporated them. And I think we'll see him draw upon that experience as he goes through his prime ministership.
Question here.
Right in.
Thank you. I just want to ask about Albanese's, about his steadfast commitment to the Voice, and also to his appointment of an Assistant Minister for the Republic, in an environment in which the cost of living is increasing, particularly with energy and inflation. Is there a danger, particularly from next year onwards, that Albanese appears preoccupied with fighting progressive cultural causes?
I think he'll be alert to that. And clearly he's taken a decision. And the decision he's taken is that simply because the country faces significant economic challenges, which his government has got to address, that is neither policy nor moral justification for him to walk away from his commitment to the Voice. I think that particular assessment is a valid assessment. I think it's wrong for a government to say, because we've got an economic problem, a major economic problem, we will therefore walk away from what we consider to be fundamental commitments in relation to Indigenous Australians. I would not criticise Albanese on those grounds at all. What I'm saying is that because he's committed to the Voice, and this is going to be very challenging, I point out that since Federation Labor governments have put 25 referendums for 24 defeats. And when I look at the debate over the last 8 weeks, it seems to me that there is a lack of preparation and naivety in the way this whole debate about the Voice is being conducted if we want to work towards a successful referendum. Now, I think the Prime Minister is going to say something further about this fairly soon, but clearly it's incumbent upon him to address this issue because I think the public needs to know a lot more about how the government sees this proposal.
There's a question down the back and then we come up here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Robin Simons. At the end of your talk, you mentioned the issue of alcohol in our Indigenous population. That was on the back, so to speak, of your article a couple of weeks ago in the Australian on Indigenous disadvantage. My question is, given that you can argue, and I believe that fetal alcohol syndrome underlies a great deal of Indigenous disadvantage, particularly obviously for the next generation, both in terms. Okay. My question is, do you think that the Albanese government will be able to withstand the blandishments of the liquor industry, etc., and the progressive, if I can call it that, to address this problem as it must be addressed?
I find it very hard to make a definitive assessment about this at this point in time, but the reason I raised it in my presentation is because I think there are some danger signs here. The decisions by the Northern Territory government I think are extremely contentious, and I notice the new Indigenous Coalition Senator Jacinta Price has spoken with incredible eloquence and force in the last 24 hours about this issue, and I think that it's incumbent upon the Albanese government to really address the situation on the ground in Aboriginal communities, and essentially it is going to face a conflict here between, if you like, progressive ideology on the one hand and practical policies on the other. I mean, I noticed, for example, that the Northern Territory Labor government has said that these laws were racist laws. And so essentially they're getting rid of racist laws. I think this language is really inflammatory language which doesn't help anybody, particularly when you've got some Indigenous communities very concerned about what's happening, and the almost certain prospect that where alcohol is being reintroduced into these communities, we are obviously going to see more violence against women.
There's a question here.
Paul, you spoke about the issue of climate change being the one of the prime features on the landscape from the Labor government's point of view, and you alluded to Chris Bowen saying that he wasn't interested in joining the group of countries that are now looking at reviving fossil fuels, but we have the Prime Minister messaging that, you know, he will not entertain the Greens' position of ruling out any new fossil fuel projects. Is that already a case of mixed messaging on the part of the government and dangerous signs in terms of how they're going to be able to handle this issue?
No, I don't think it's a case of mixed messaging. On the climate change bill, both Albanese and Chris Bowen have been on exactly the same page. They've said right from the start that the government would not entertain any significant amendments to the climate change bill, and they made it quite clear that they would not accept the proposal from the Greens that there be commitments against new fossil fuel projects. The point Chris Bowen was making, I think, was a different point, a broader strategic point. And he was essentially saying, despite what's happening in Europe for very good reasons, given what's happened between Russia and the Ukraine, despite that, and despite the fact that a number of countries are looking back to fossil fuels, Australia is in a different situation, and that the government's commitments in that sense won't change. I mean, essentially that was Chris Bowen's message, that the platform on which the government got elected, that is the 43% emissions reduction target with a renewables target, I think, of around 80%, that's going to stay in place. So I don't think there's any conflict.
I know we're on the government, but I'd like to switch to the other side. My observation of this election is it's done a really big damage to the Liberals, and I see the Teals maybe operating on the Liberals like the DLP operated on Labor. There's a whole chunk of Liberal votes have gone to a party, well, not a party, independents by name, that are giving their preferences to the Labor Party. And this could see the Labor government staying with us for quite some time. How do you see it?
I think this is an absolutely decisive election. I don't think there's ever been an election like this in my time as a working political journalist, in the sense that what we've seen on the coalition side of politics is an attack, a successful attack on some of the once prized Liberal Party blue ribbon seats, and 6 of those seats were lost. Those seats are fundamental to the Liberal Party. Those seats contain some outstanding Liberal MPs. in the case of Josh Frydenberg, someone widely accepted as a future leader of the Liberal Party. Those seats contain a lot of financial power and brains trust power for the Liberals. So I do think that this is a really fundamental election in terms of structural damage done to the Liberal Party. In that sense, Anne, I would be inclined to agree with the gravity with which you raised the issue. I think there is an existential issue here for the Liberals. I don't want to get too carried away, but I would just point out that political parties don't have any guarantee of survival. I mean, I don't see the Liberal Party fading away or the coalition fading away, but I think there are parallels with the DLP. And I know Anne raised that. I do think there are parallels because essentially what we see here is we see a movement that had great on-the-ground support, very significant financial support, a real sense of ideological commitment, a lot of media support, and it took away a slice of Liberal Party seats, and it's not as though this movement is a movement like the relationship between the Greens and Labor, where a lot of people who once voted for Labor now vote Green, but the Green preferences go back to Labor 80%. No, I think that the bulk of the Teals are essentially people who will support the centre-left of politics. So I think a lot of damage has been done to the Liberals, and I think the way back is going to be very, very difficult.
We've got to be really quick. We've got a question up the back. We've got a question here. We've got to be really quick. Yep.
Yes, just hypothetically about the recession, if the RBA, if they raise the rate too high and there could be recession, but if they don't do that, we could have inflation get out of control. So what do you think, if that's the choice for the government, which one they will choose? Thank you.
Well, we know what the government's choice would be, and that's the same choice that the Governor of the Reserve Bank would pick, as he indicated last week. What he wants to do is to get inflation back to 2 to 3% while keeping the economy on an even keel. I think one of the fascinating issues is, given the bank miscalculated during the pandemic by being too dovish, by being too soft on inflation, might there be a risk now that they're fighting inflation that they might err on the upside and be too hawkish? I'm not saying that'll happen, I just raised that as a possibility, but I want to repeat what I said in my presentation, that I think the balance of probability is that Australia will be able to avoid recession. I think our inflationary situation is not nearly as bad as a number of other countries, and hopefully the Reserve Bank will be able to demonstrate the appropriate nous.
A quick question, we've got to finish in 2 minutes. Yeah.
Yes, about foreign policy, you said that all the national security strategy agenda has been inherited to the new Labour government. Then including China, US, Quad, AUKUS, and Japan and India. Then are there any elements inside the party or in the parliament about the having different foreign policy ideas, and can the government retain the consensus in the parliament or in the party?
I think that depends on events. There's no doubt that I think when Labor was in opposition and the leadership made the commitment to the AUKUS agreement, to the nuclear-powered submarine agreement, I think that there were quite a few people in the caucus who wondered about the wisdom of that, while recognising that it was an electoral necessity for Anthony Albanese to do it. Now, I think Albanese and Richard Marles and Penny Wong, as Prime Minister, Defence Minister and Foreign Minister, so far have displayed a lot of skill and a lot of commitment. And I think the changes they've introduced in terms of energy, in terms of tone, in terms of diplomacy, in terms of dialogue, have all been good, while at the same time the message about the fundamental strategic continuity is there. There's absolutely no doubt at all about that. So I think so far that Labor has handled this very well. I'll give them very high marks for this. We'll have to see what happens in the future, but I'd just say one thing. Here. There are going to be really significant challenges because you can't do nuclear-powered submarines without the defence budget going significantly above 3% of GDP. Yep. We know that we're staring at a debt around about $1 trillion. We know that Anthony Albanese was elected on an agenda of compassion. Where is going to be the scope for very significant increases in the defence budget? So that is going to be a major problem. And Richard Marles has indicated that around about next March, he will produce the answers in terms of the submarine. What sort of submarine we get, the cost, the building arrangements, and what he will do about the capability gap, seeing we're not going to get the submarines until the late 2030s. This is going to be a very, very challenging time for the Albanese government when Richard Marles outlines this. What I'd say about AUKUS is this. AUKUS was a Scott Morrison initiative. It was a Liberal Party initiative. There's no way if Labor had been in government at the time, Labor would have done this. But Labor's won the election, so Labor has got to implement Scott Morrison's strategic agenda. That's the reality. And at some point, this is going to be a very difficult issue for Labor politically. However, I just want to reiterate what I said. So far, Albanese, Marles and Wong, to me, look very good.
We have to finish at the top of the hour tonight, so to say thanks, Paul, for a terrific presentation, and no doubt you'll be back again soon. For tonight, that's it. Thanks, folks.